consistency in the time you have available. So if you have 10 hours a week, make it the best 10 hours a week you can possibly have with your sport. Make sure that it is achievable week in, week out. The frequency in which you do that training in that 10 hours needs to be week in, week out. It can't go from 8 hours to 12 hours to 4 hours to 2 hours. If you commit to it, the best athletes I've had have always had consistency in the hours they've had to be able to achieve their training.
The Triathlon Show 217. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Coach Dan Adkins, who is the head coach at the Gold Coast Triathlon Australia Performance Centre. We had a really great chat on all things training that do not apply just to the elite athletes that Dan coaches, but really to any endurance athlete. And I think that any of you will find this discussion extremely useful and valuable. I certainly did, and really enjoyed the chat I had with Dan. We'll get right to it after thanking our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. In a blog post Precision Hydration has, that I'll link to in the show notes, they reference a 2017 review paper where the sweat rates of a total of 500 athletes was investigated. And this review paper found that 1 to 1.5 liters per hour is a pretty normal or moderate sweat rate, but the ranges of sweat rates range from 0.5 liters per hour to just over 2.5 liters per hour, with a few outliers at above 4 liters per hour as well. So you can see that there's a big inter-individual difference here. So I'll link to the article that Precision Hydration has on the topic called How to Measure Your Sweat Rate to Improve Your Hydration Strategy. And that article will instruct you how to do just that. Simply find out what your individual sweat rate is. And when you combine that with knowing what your sweat sodium content is estimated to be, which you can do by getting your hydration plan for free on precisionhydration.com, then you can really start to narrow down your hydration strategy and make it really work for you and your individual attributes as a sweater. So that will be linked to in the show notes, and if you want to try Precision Hydration's electrolytes, you can get 15% off with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And big thanks to Roka that you can find on roka.com. And since the racing season is slowly but surely getting closer, I thought I would mention that for athletes that are racing early season races where the water temperatures might still be pretty darn cold, it's good to mention that Roka does not simply offer their normal wetsuit ranges with the different levels of wetsuits, but actually they also have their Maverick Pro in a thermal wetsuit version, which is a fantastic option if you are one of those that are going to be racing in any race at any time in cold water. But now that we're coming up to the early season for people in the Northern Hemisphere at least, it's very much on the agenda for a lot of you, I'm sure. So check out the Maverick Pro thermal wetsuit. Like all Roka wetsuits, it comes with their patented technologies, RS2 centerline buoyancy and arms up construction for optimal mobility. So a highly developed and researched wetsuit that is highly recommended. You can get 20% off your entire order, whether it's wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear, with the promo code TTS20 on roka.com. Now, without any further ado, let's hear the interview with Coach Dan Adkins. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Dan. How are you doing?
Michael, thank you. I'm really good, thank you. Really happy to be here. Thanks for the offer.
It's a pleasure to have you. Why don't you start by first introducing yourself to the listeners who may not know who you are?
Yeah, thanks. My name's Dan Adkins. I'm an Australian high performance triathlon coach. I work with our national system, primarily focused on major competition, which for us at the ITU draft legal level is the Olympics. Our second tier major event, which is every alternate second year to the Olympics, if that makes sense, is the Commonwealth Games and obviously ITU World Championships every year, as well as the WTS series.
And you're the head coach at one of the performance centers and daily training environments over there in Australia?
Yeah, that's right. I run the performance centre here on the Gold Coast in Queensland, Australia. And I've been in this role for the last, it's coming up to 7 years now, believe it or not, how quickly time flies. And our primary focus has been the development of Australian athletes only. It's not what I'd call a centralised program. It's not something we've targeted specific athletes. It's just I was employed to set up a program that was based on the Gold Coast as a part of the Australian Institute of Sport, to which we have a facility here on the Gold Coast, and collaborate with local universities as well in research and development of athletes. So something is a very privileged position that I've been in for the last 7 years.
So, just as a bit of context for those following the ITU circuit and the WTS races and so on, who are some of the athletes that you worked with that have come through at that performance center, or you are working with right now?
Currently, our roster is 10 athletes in total. Matt Hauser, a young 21-year-old ITU elite athlete who won the junior world title in 2017 and was on our Commonwealth Games team in 2018. Mixed team relay athlete that has done quite well over the years is one of our athletes. Jazz Hedgeland, who is a WTS level athlete, finished 7th this year in Edmonton, 9th in Montreal. I also have 2 under 23s that finished 5th last year now in Lausanne, Kira Hedgeland in the women's and Brandon Copeland in the men's. As well as I also have some para athletes. So my program is a little different to most, where I've streamlined it down now as we get closer to Tokyo to 2 specific athletes, Katie Kelly and her guide Brianna Silk, who are the current Paralympic champions from Rio, and also in the PTVI. So that's one of the vision impaired categories. And also Lauren Parker, who is the current para wheelchair world champion. So, yeah, amongst that, I have some other athletes that are in either the under 23 program, or I have one junior as well, Charlotte Derbyshire, who got 20th at Worlds last year. So, yeah, we have a nice spread of what I like to call development athletes.
Right, cool. So the first thing that I wanted to discuss today is your view on the demands of draft legal sprint and Olympic distance races and even mixed relay that is now coming into the Olympics this year. What are the demands of this type of racing and the requirement for success, both at a general level and also from the perspective of each individual discipline?
Yeah, that's a great question. The demands for me, first and foremost, is having the athletes available. It's a real key word for me, is being available, and it's something I've learned over the last 10 years of coaching within our national system, is that we had a history of probably pushing athletes too hard too soon. We've also always had a rich history in Australia of that word talent comes into it, which I'm not a fan of, but talented athletes that have come through as young athletes, because we've got obviously the environment to produce triathletes with the sun and lots of nice weather. So for me, in general, as long as my athletes are available, then they're capable of being coached. So draft legal racing obviously is very intense racing. It is very technical, tactical, and I like to think that we put a fair emphasis on the demands of competition, which is understanding race formats, race courses, and knowing when to peak. So what are our key events? And the issue, if I can call it that we have in Australia, is that a lot of our selection races are done when the other side of the world is somewhat in their base phase or in their initial phase of training. So in Australia, we have a lot of key events down under, which are have a lot of ITU points up for grabs, and also a lot of selection up for grabs. So we have our continental championships begin in 2 weeks' time for the para event, and start not long after that for our able-bodied athletes in 2 or 3 weeks' time. So we have to get a wriggle on reasonably early. So when we talk of the demands of racing, it's something I've had to learn to be very calculated in, and that is, how do we plan to be good in February, March, April, but also sustain a long season through to world titles, which is generally August, September. So in general, my number one goal is to get the athletes available, and that is a very long and complex answer to how we can have that happen. So I guess with swimming, I come from a swim background as a coach. That was how I started my career as a coach, and I learned that reverse periodization was something that suited my style of coaching, but also suited the younger athletes that I developed. So we would start quite hard, quite early, and that was with what I call skills and drills. So a lot of the swimming we begin our phase of training in, which starts in late November, which is probably a lot earlier than most other nations. So I like to reverse periodize my swimming, because I find we get a lot of conditioning from our swimming, and the fact that we live in an environment where we can swim open water a lot, whether it be in the surf or lakes or canals. I like to sort of bang in, for want of a better term, some fitness into them. And that's something I've always done, which is a little different, and something that I've followed through for the last sort of 15 years. Cycling is I've been very inquisitive about cycling over the years, and definitely the trend of male triathlon, I believe, in ITU is that the bike is starting to really improve the levels of power outputs and pressure that's put on in the races. A few nations have shown that they're really emphasizing that area. So slowly but surely, we've really built up our volume and the consistency in which we're training. So we've probably gone from once upon a time sort of 3 key rides a week to probably 4 key rides a week. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're incredibly intense, but key rides meaning there's some specificity around chasing some power targets. Power targets may be low, but at a sort of 85% of effort. And again, it's sort of getting best bang for buck. And the old adage that nick time is what we used to call it back in my day when I was a triathlete. having that nick time, spending time in the saddle is very important. And I've sort of had a about face with that. And now we're trying to really build up some volume. And we're fortunate here on the Gold Coast that we have some good mountains and lots of hilly, quite gradient rides that we can take on board week in, week out. So I think probably for me, riding is 80% strength. So with that, climbing and longer sustained rolling 8 to 15 minute turns with boys and girls that I coach to keep that race specificity there, but also give them that strength there on the bike. And running is something that sometimes I have a tendency to let the group dictate the running, in the sense that we focus early on just simple kilometres, simple miles, if you want to call it, that it's just about getting back in the groove of things. But technically, I'm big on video feedback. I try to video every single run we do. I try to give the athletes ownership on what they're working on, and we come up with cues. So real skill acquisition style of running. We work on cues with each athlete, and each athlete have an array of different cues that they're working on with their running. So the first 4 weeks of our preparatory phase is really around awareness, body awareness, and movement patterns across the ground before we can really start doing the work. Because as we know in our sport, the running has the most impact on the body, and we never run fresh. We always run fatigued. So that's a bit of a snapshot of how we work it. And obviously, as we get closer to racing, we'll sharpen our tools and start trying to prepare to race.
Excellent. Yeah, I have a few follow-up questions here. First of all, with the availability, can you give just one or two key factors that you consider when it comes to making sure that you have your athletes available?
Well, we hear often that endurance sport is about being able to be repetitive in your training. I've heard other people use the frequency of training. So how often are you turning up? How often are you utilizing the time you have to be able to train, whether that be an age group athlete or even an elite athlete? I believe we all have time to work with rather than time against. If time against tends to bring on pressure and stress, and that tends to bring on injury and illness, if you want to ask me. So being available is multifaceted. It's like a huge tree with different branches, and each branch has its strengths and weaknesses, and every now and then you've got to go out on that branch that may be a little less supportive than the other. So as athletes develop, and a lot of my career has been around athlete development, I'm very fortunate that I have a lot of athletes that have been with me since they were young juniors. Something I feel very proud of, that we've evolved. We haven't dissolved. We've evolved athletes from juniors, young juniors, through to now targeting Tokyo Olympics this year, which is something I'm very proud of, and hopefully I can be there on the start line next to them. But being available comes under nutrition. I work hard with my staff around nutrition, and I'm of the belief that that's a huge area that we can improve and evolve with. Obviously, recovery in our sport is the one of the biggest factors, and recovery might mean spending 20 minutes on a roller post a training session. It might mean adding in another physiotherapy session once a week. So obviously rehab and recovery is a massive part of it, but basically being able to turn up every day and taking on what's set in front of you is what I mean by being available.
And you'll have to excuse me for diving so deep, but it's pretty rare to have these WTS coaches on the podcast, because that's where I find that it's quite difficult to even get contact details in the first place. So I'm going to make use of this opportunity.
No problem.
But when you mentioned nutrition there, and we can do a lot to improve that, what specifically is it that we typically need to improve, or the athletes that you work with typically need to improve? Is it just eating more, or what are you referring to?
Well, we're very fortunate in this day, Michael, as opposed to maybe 20 years where I came from as an athlete, and that is that there's so many tests and body analysis we can study within each athlete, and I guess this comes down to the individual and understanding metabolic rate, understanding each athlete's metabolism rates is something that I've worked closely with our Institute of Sport to understand. Well, when this athlete turns up and they've had an 8-hour sleep, how much have they burned in their sleep? So some of our ITU athletes, they tend to burn more in their sleep, the more calories or kilojoules in their sleep than the average age group 38-hour a week, 15-hour a week trainer will burn. So we have to educate the athlete that you need to eat more than the average, what we say in Australia, Joe Blow. So understanding that side of things has been an area that I've worked on. I'm not a real scientific coach. I like to think I'm more the artist. I'm not the sort of bloke that will tear apart Training Peaks or look at Strava or any of those things and go, wow, look at the numbers of the power or the heart rate or this or that. But what I really work hard at is understanding, well, how many calories should this guy intake during a 3-hour ride so I can get him to a 5K threshold swim session in the afternoon, so I can get him to turn up tomorrow morning and do a 15K run with 5 kilometers of hill in it. So it's all about thinking ahead of the session we're about to partake in. So I'm really along with my team, trying to educate the athletes in, I believe a lot of stress fractures, a lot of injuries, a lot of immune system illnesses are coming not necessarily from overloaded training, but nutrition strategies or lack of. So for me, it's understanding what each athlete is available. So I'm happy to spend time investing time and money into understanding what everybody is born with, and that's different. You can't train some of these things. You can't reconfigurate someone that has a high metabolic rate. You can't. It's impossible. It's not the way that it's a genetic. When they talk about genetic talent, you might have someone that's born with 2 gifted triathlete parents, but you're not necessarily going to be a great triathlete unless you train for it. However, if you're born with a high metabolism, then if you don't feed that metabolism, you're not going to be able to survive in our sport. It's a simple fact of the matter. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yes, it does. It does perfectly, and it's really interesting to hear. But I would definitely agree that that's important, and I would argue that probably even for age groupers, even though they obviously in a lot of cases they're not anywhere near the caloric demands of elite athletes, simply because of less training, and in many cases a lesser basal metabolic rate due to genetics and such. But still, that is something that they too and we too can improve on. And as you said, thinking about in what metabolic state we come into the afternoon or evening session when we're doing our morning bike ride. And it's not just about getting through this workout that we're in now, but how are we going to start the next workout, and having that in mind and planning ahead. So yeah, really appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem.
Let's talk talk a little bit about the training and even some supporting strategies to that you use. So if we start very generally, like what is the range of training volume that you will typically be at with your kind of athletes?
Okay. Yeah, well, again, if I go back to where I started, I believe I have a really strong group of development athletes. So whilst Matt Hauser has finished top 7 at a WTS and has won 2 world titles, one as an elite in the mixed team relay and one as a junior. I still feel we're only probably 60% towards his ceiling as far as an aerobic endurance athlete. So I try to be very aware of each of my athletes, and I try to make sure that we don't ever hit that ceiling. I don't ever want to get to the point where the athletes can't get off the ground if we've had a demanding session. I want to make sure that, again, I'm going to say this 1,000 times in this podcast, that they're available to turn up in the afternoon to be able to get through the next session, because our sport must be mundane. It must be repetitive, and it must be almost robotic in the way that we are able to give the best with what time we have available, whether that's 12 hours as an age group athlete or whether that's 30 hours as an elite athlete. We need to make sure that each session has purpose and has real strategies around what it is we're aiming to meet. So for me, right now, if you'd like me to talk about right now, our strategy is around strength, endurance. It's around creating that platform. So put in simple terms, again, I'm not a real scientific coach. I'm a pretty laid-back Aussie, and I like to think that when I coached Learn to Swim, that I had to dumb things down to talk to little tiny 3-year-olds how to swim. And if I talk in those terms, we're building a house. And if we're building a house right now, we're laying the slab of concrete to support the house. And that slab of concrete needs to have a good steel structure underneath. It needs to be absolutely solid to handle cyclones. It needs to be or tornadoes or typhoons or wherever you may live in the world. It needs to be able to handle all those weather conditions. So for me right now, we are swim biking and running with absolute strength in mind. So in the pool, it might be longer sub, so below threshold swimming, but we'll always tap into, remembering I said earlier, I like to reverse periodize my swimming. We'll always tap into that top end speed. I'm blessed the fact that I have young, fast athletes that like to go fast, and I don't ever want them to lose touch with what they love about the sport, because at the end of the day, fun is what brought them to me, and a love of our sport. I want them to enjoy what they do, and if it means getting up at the end of a 5-kilometer swim and saying, all right, we're going to have a 4x50 relay, but we have to tumble turn halfway along the pool and accelerate out, head up freestyle on the way back, just to make it fun, then that's what I'll do. But what I'm tapping into is some real top end speed post a strength session. So we'll run under fatigue off hill reps. We'll do some tempo running, and tempo at the moment might be 10 seconds a kilometer slower than what it will be in 2 months' time. Well, that's what I'm hoping anyway. As well, biking. We're in a strength phase, which can be quite arduous, riding hill reps that are, we're doing 1,500, 2,000 meters of climbing in a session. That's a lot of climbing. So how can I keep them invigorated through this time of year? Well, we might do some 15-second full gas power surges off a track stand, off a set of lights. So I'm trying to incorporate the technical side of our sport, learn how to track stand, learn how to accelerate off the satellites. So I guess some strategies for me are keeping the fun aspect in there, reverting back to the person you were when you first started the sport, to going, well, what are the demands of competition day in, day out? What are the things that I can keep in our training that's not going to impact too much to be able to get through the 25, 30 hours a week of training that we do?
And as you get closer to the racing season, will you start to then pull the intensity or push the intensity up towards race intensity, possibly even above it, or what will that look like?
Absolutely. Again, as I said, the Australian summer is going to be an interesting one this year. 2020 going into the Olympics, we have athletes that need to perform by April in Australia. So I'm not the sort of person that will put someone on the start line and say you need to do well in this race without giving them some awareness of what they're capable of. So the intensity in training for me, throughout a week, I will sit down and I will look at the program and I will highlight some key sessions. Within that key session, we may have some targeted race-specific opportunities. And that could be 3 times a week. That could be 4 times a week. This week, I think we are going to touch on 7 critical pieces of work that we will touch on race specifics. Now, to put that in context, tomorrow morning is going to be 4 by 15 second pieces of sprint work that is race specific. Now that, we may have a boy that can average 1,000 watts for that. So that's very high if you understand wattage. It may be 800, 700, 800 watts for a female, which is very high. So I keep the intensity there at all times because I believe a lot of athletes find that fun, as long as you don't overdo it and you don't do it all the time. And we've all seen and we've all been a part of the culture of going faster more often is the way to go, but that has changed in the last 5 years, I believe. So, but I also believe that we need to touch on it often, but not necessarily for a long period of time, just to break up the monotony of the work that we have to do per week.
So am I hearing you right when you're talking about intensity, that you do include it frequently and often, but no single session is going to be a killer session, or at least very few of them is going to be a killer session with the athlete laying on the ground after a hard track set? You always want to keep something left in the tank. Is that what you're saying? Or if you're not, then please clarify.
No, absolutely. We probably, and this is the honest truth, we probably would only leave those stretcher sessions, if you want to call them that, where you've got to wheel the athlete off or shovel him off the dirt, probably only 3 or 4 times a year. That's a year. Again, because I want them to be able to turn up tomorrow and the next day, or even this afternoon or lunchtime or whatever it is. And I do not understand how you can physically do that in our sport, that those sessions are done to maximal effort. I used to coach 50-meter sprinters in swimming, a butterflyer that went to a very high level, and I could get him to do it very, very small periods of time, and he was a sprinter. So I don't understand how we can get our endurance athletes to do that. But yes, only 3 or 4 sessions a year, I will say this is all on. And they will be very probably, we'll look at 10 to 16 days out from competition. We may do two of those sessions from a major competition. They just can't recover from them effectively, I find. That's my theory.
Yeah. And when you're saying that this has changed in the last 5 years, is it that you've changed your philosophy, or do you see a general change in the triathlon community and coaches world round are catching up to this knowledge now?
I sort of giggled a little there because I probably have changed my own philosophy on that, Michael, a lot. Inadvertently, I felt that, and this is probably going more than 5 years ago, probably 8 years ago, I felt that harder was better, and we're going to create these superhumans that are going to be able to handle with, sustained track session week after week after week. And a lot of that was driven from my former life of a age group club-based coach that had elite athletes in there as well, and you're sort of trying to facilitate programs that helped 30 athletes, 40 athletes, 50 athletes, as opposed to the 10 that I coach now. So you look back then and you go, wow, how did we keep people on the paddock? How are we able to keep athletes sustainable when we were running them faster than they were racing all the time? So over time, I just learned that it was, a good, solid, hard tartan run track would take 4 or 5 days to get over. So that's no use to me now. If I've got to train in another 10 hours time, that's no use to me at all, especially if you want to get something out of it. So I've certainly changed my tune, and thankfully I've had a lot of good people in my corner to be able to advise me and help me and evolve me, and a lot of good reading and good study has helped me also understand that endurance sport is about turning up. It's not about absolutely smashing yourself into the ground where you need a shovel to pick you up.
Yeah. And there was one other follow-up question that I had there, but I just forgot that. I had it at the tip of my tongue. So let's move on to the next one that I wanted to get into. If you, as much as you can, I understand if you don't want to reveal all the details, but can you explain, now as we're talking, it's the 10th of January today. Mm-hmm. What is the week that you're in looking like, the structure of it, like how many sessions in each discipline, and what are the basic format of those sessions, and so on?
It's 10th of January. We are in week 8 of our reintegration for the 2020 year. So again, as I mentioned earlier, Australia tend to start earlier with, we have 4 reasonably high-level races here in Australia starting in late February. So we are in what I would like to call our second period of training. The first period led up to Christmas was 6 weeks, of a good baseline, just getting out there, understanding how our body's moving, how has our body reacted to the break that every athlete needs to have mentally. Physically, it's the worst thing an endurance athlete can do, because tendons shorten, muscles, shrink, weight goes on, weight goes off. So it's a tricky period. I find I have more injuries in that first 6 weeks than I do pretty much the whole year. So it's a really stressful time for me as a coach and, dare I say, a manager of a program. It's so I'm happy to present that I've got all my athletes, here we go again, available. So I feel I've done a good job in that first block. This second block now, we are now really focusing on strength. So we are doing some testing as well. We're doing some heat acclimation testing. I won't go too much into that. If the studies prove to be successful, I'd happy to come on here and reveal the study. But we're doing some really cool stuff with Bond University, which is excellent for me to be a part of a university that's really open-minded and they love my what if questions. That I've got no theory behind, but I just pose these questions and they find a way to try and test it. But in the water, we've gone away from a little bit more top end. We've begun open water swimming already. Obviously, Australia, especially the Gold Coast, is very hot and humid. Unfortunately, the rest of the country is under blaze, and there's a lot of our country on fire at the moment, which is very upsetting. But thankfully here on the Gold Coast, because of our humid climate, we are protected somewhat from that. But we are absolutely always 24/7 in a heat and humidity training environment. It's currently 29 degrees Celsius and around 75% humidity. So it's sticky. So that is a natural environment for us, which allows us to acclimatize and, I believe, really improve our aerobic capacity. That's our weapon. So I like to utilize that, and slowly but surely we're building up our volume, and the intensity is, as I said, there's certain touch points throughout the run. We've begun running some hills, short, sharp, sort of 200-meter hills where the athletes can still hold form. Anything longer than sort of 90 seconds to 2 minutes at some sort of pace, I find athletes fall away. So I don't want that. So we're very cadence and posture focused with the running there. The biking is very much around the strength endurance, but then tapping into some top end power, because again, as I mentioned earlier, the athletes love doing that. They love to go hard. So that may only be 10 seconds, 15 seconds of absolute power, but something I learned from some cycling coaches or cycling physiologists that are high up in the pro tour sort of stuff. So yeah, that's sort of where we're at. But privileged to be here where we are, being the environment we have right now.
What's a typical number of swims, bikes, and runs per week, or what's your number this week, for example?
This week will be 5 swims, 1 open water, front end specific, so focusing on the first 200 meters of a race, as well as some technical, tactical skills around turning cans. That was this morning, actually. That was our first swim session in the open water. We've done 4 other sessions as well in the water, which are around aerobic conditioning. The bike tomorrow will be our 4th ride of the week. We'll only do the 4 rides this week, but that'll be upwards of around 350 kilometers for the week. So in general terms, it's not over the top, but again, I have development athletes and I'm trying to balance out, and I don't want to hit the ceiling. So I'm very conscious of the amount of work and volume that I'm giving them right now, so that they're able to sustain the whole season up until September. Running, we are up around the 6 sessions a week. 80% of that is aerobic. Running, we do 1 session a week, which is very focused on technique and drills. And I'm always looking for athlete feedback. So again, I mentioned earlier about athlete cues and who is it that they want to look like? Who do they want to look like when they run? Who is it that they've seen running and go, I could look like that moves well? So I allow them that input. And what have I missed out there? And gym. So
kilometers on the run, roughly?
Run.
What would that?
It varies from 40 kilometers a week for the junior to around. We're only up to about 60 kilometers a week at the moment. So not high volume, but again, I only mentioned to them yesterday, they're all looking good. So when we're doing 60 kilometers a week and they're looking great, I know it's probably time to probably load it up a little bit. So we'll be looking to load that run volume over the next 4 weeks.
Yeah, and 60 kilometers of deliberate practice with great form, great posture.
Absolutely.
That's still like a lot of good training.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
total number of hours for the week will be roughly what?
They're probably around the 25 hours a week at the moment. That's inclusive of gym, strength and conditioning sessions, which we do probably more than most. I'm very focused on functional strength patterns and posterior chain and getting their transverse core and intrinsic core and so forth. It's a critical piece for us, especially the last sort of 20% of the run. I believe that posture and form is everything. So we have a very targeted program around that. So they're probably doing 6 hours a week of strength and conditioning, as well as the 20 odd hours a week of general swim, bike, running.
So for strength and conditioning, what would be a few favorite exercises that you prescribe?
Well, everything we do in the gym is focused back to swim, bike, run. So my absolute favorite exercise is pull-ups, chin-ups. Very, very slow, very controlled. It absolutely works 2/3 of your body, especially for running, swimming, and biking. Posture on the bike, holding good strength through your core, your glutes, your hamstrings on the bike, through to posture on the run. As I mentioned, I focus more my planning around the last, say, 2 kilometers of the run. And in swimming, obviously, that initial phase of catch in the water to the, if you're not in the front 200 of any swim at an ITU level, nowadays you're pretty much done. So I like to, chin ups is my go-to. That's one part.
Yeah, that's perfect. And now I remember what the other follow-up that I forgot earlier was, and that was in terms of when we were talking about intensity and not wanting to hit the ceiling with that either, not wanting to go to the well. How do you control that? Do you prescribe sessions or efforts with RPE, heart rate, pace? Do you have specific limits, or how do you work with that?
We used to use, up until, and this is something I used for 15 years, was training zones, basically 1 to 5. 1 meaning getting out of bed in the morning, walking to the toilet, to 5 maximal effort. But this year we're working on RPE completely, wholly and solely. So I'm finding that we've got a better range with RPE 1 to 10. So your aerobic conditioning might be 5 to 7, which gives me a bit better scope. With that, we hand it. It correlates better for me with heart rate. So heart rate is always based between, i.e., 160 to 170 might be RPE 6 to 8. So, but then the next person, 160, 170 might be 8 to 9. So it takes a lot of work to understand each athlete's heart rate, but it's something I'm very, very invested in to understanding. I think it is the truest form of understanding the human engine that we're all built with. So educating the athletes on those two pure training sort of zones is critical to our longevity and our evolution.
Do you have any athletes that you have to really educate a lot on? The type of athlete that always want to go faster and see the pace be better than the last week, or the power be better than the last week. And how do you educate like the process thinking and not seeing that as like the main driver of success necessarily?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think I'm alone in my program with this, that I very, very, very rarely tell my athletes they need to go faster. I'm always telling them that they need to hold back, that form's fallen away, or their numbers are just not producing what I'm after, or what they should be after, and they're getting caught up in the moment. Again, I have a lot of young males. I have a group of 5 young males that are between the ages of 19 and 23. So there's a lot of testosterone there. There's a lot of alpha wolf pack mentality there, and there's always one wolf that wants to stand out more than the other, and each of them have a dominant factor in their training. So it comes back to the art of coaching, and that's communication. That's being able to, maybe not in the session. Sometimes with these alpha males, you just got to let it run its course. If you try and pull the wolf pack up, you can get your head bit off. So sometimes you got to let it run its course, and then you've probably got to pull them aside later on and say, hey, listen. And you've got to make sure you've got the information there to prove your point, or not. I don't like to say prove your point, to state your claim here that, we could probably be better here. And, neither of my 5 males are the same in every facet. They're all different, and you most definitely, I'm telling them, actually, we could probably slow that down and be a more efficient, more economic athlete if we did it this way. So it's education, and it's communication is the biggest thing, and not ramming it down their throat. You ram it down the 22-year-old's throat, he's only going to bark back at you, and that's not productive for longevity as a coach-athlete relationship. That's for sure.
That leads in nicely to discussing the daily training environment and the group aspect of your training. How important do you think that is for the athletes to be in that environment and training with that group?
It's something we've worked really hard at. It's something that I pride myself on, is that we have a good culture within our group. We're quite open, as far as I'm probably too open. Sometimes my performance director says to me I need to be a little bit more closed shop, but I like to show people what we have. We are an Australian performance centre, and we have a lot of younger athletes around that idolise our group, and they look up to our group, and I think it's important to expose our group to the younger generation of athletes coming through, to put a little bit of upward pressure on the guys I coach. So the training environment is something that we work very closely at. I was an ex-rugby league player, and that was my passion, and I was hopefully going to represent my country at that sport, and team sport was something I grew up in and around, and I'm trying to create a team, but now a team of individuals. So we work hard at trying to make sure that the individual gets what they need, and obviously that's time consuming to be able to stand there at a run session and you've got 10 people, but you've got 6 different sessions going, and you just see them disperse, and you may not see them for 5 to 10 minutes, and then they run past, and then you don't see another one for another 10 minutes and whatever. So, but that's necessary, because no 2 athletes are the same, or no 2 athletes are at the same point. So I love the sessions where we can all come together and we're all doing the same thing, but they're very, very rare. And that comes down to what each athlete needs. But our daily training environment is built around a common set of values that we've all bought into, and obviously number one is respect and honesty. And I'm going to say this, Michael, but I'm not sure you might have to blurt it out, but we have a no dickhead policy. So excuse me if that's a little out there to say, but I don't do high school yard tormenting or bullying or anything like that. So we make sure that we're all in there doing the same thing. We're all very respectful of each other, and that's something that I value very dearly.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And you already kind of answered my next question, which is how you include the individualization of the athlete in that group training environment. And it sounds like you do it a lot. Does that happen just organically because you prescribe the RPE of the session and each athlete chooses their own intensity based on that? Or do you have some sort of baseline testing as well, maybe in the background that also sort of defines how hard you want that RPE for the athlete to be? That if they're at a level further on in their development point, then you might have them go slightly harder for a session than another, and so on. How, if you go a little bit deeper into the individualization and how that plays into the training?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a very complex question to answer. But however, at the end of the day, the testing we do is very much in the initial phase of what we do. So it gives me baseline, an opportunity to see where we are at a baseline, see whether we've improved anything in the athlete in the last 12 months, or it gives me an understanding of who, I've taken on a couple of new athletes in the last year, so it's understanding of what they're capable of potentially. But it does organically happen. To go back to what you mentioned earlier about do some athletes just go beyond what they're probably physically capable of? Absolutely. But it gives me an argument or a discussion point later on to talk about how we can be better the next session. So again, the art of coaching is something that I probably am, I know I'm a lot more schooled in rather than the science of it. And I would never replace that. I would never change that for the fact that me understanding my athletes well enough, from the way they walk into the training session to the way they even say hello, to the way they to what they're wearing, to how much pride they've taken in their personal appearance to turn up to training, to how they carry their posture, to know that, okay, so this may be a struggle this session. And, there's been some sessions where I've gotten someone out of the pool and I've said, and what I'm saying, is it a foreign language to you today? Or is what I'm saying just too hard for you to comprehend today? And 99 out of 100 times, they'll just feel comfortable enough to let me know that there's other things going on. So, and that might be personal, something in life. It might be physical. It might be anxiety as we head towards races, which is always a big thing. So the management of the athlete very much has to be individual, not necessarily a different training session, but around how they go after that session to get the best possible outcome for themselves.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, rigidity is something that can be quite dangerous, and the absolute gold standard is obviously to have the coach on deck at all times and be able to adjust as needed, depending on the individual athlete's needs. And that's something that's body language and other things you can pick up from that
Absolutely.
You can't pick up just from reading their training files.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing that I wanted to ask is, since you also have the para athletes in your squad, is that something that the athletes of both groups, the para athletes and the able-bodied athletes, have found that they can learn from each other? Perhaps because I assume that the para athletes might have some different skills, different mindset, perhaps that might be useful if it translates to what the able-bodied athletes do, and vice versa.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that the able-bodied athletes need to understand is the para-athletes' stories. And that is how they came to have their disability. And I hate saying that word because it's not a disability. It's a I believe it's something that they've just got and we deal with, no different to athlete mood. So understanding their stories has been empowering in my program. And it's something that I put my hand up to have a crack. That's another Aussie term. Have a crack at trying to coach. And I was looking for a new challenge for myself as a coach. And again, probably taking on more than I needed, but it was an opportunity for me to test myself and to see basically, well, it was to test myself. And how we work it is that we integrate and we are side by side. So for the better part, yes, this morning we had Lauren Parker, who's the world champion in the wheelchair category, and Katie Kelly, who is the PTVI current Paralympic champion, swimming side by side with our able-bodied program. And I set different challenges so that it integrates well. So they may start 15 seconds ahead of the main group, and we play the old rabbit and the bloody, chaser sort of mentality. Go and get them, boys. Go and get them, girls. Chase them down, and it pushes a new level out of the para squad. But at the same time, there's an absolute respect. I stood back watching Kai Wild, one of my under-23 athletes, watching intently Lauren Parker do her brick session this morning on the chair and the push chair, and it was 30 degrees, hot as heck, hot. It was 30-degree water, and here she is pounding this brick session. He was in awe of what she was doing, and he almost looked at me with a filthy look as if to say, "You're making her work too hard." But the power in that was that they're invested. Able-bodied athletes are invested in my para-athletes, and we are united as one. There is no able-bodied para-triathlon squad. That was what we used to be called. We were the national under-23 development para-triathlon program. I had a problem with that, and I changed it, and thankfully Justin Drew, our performance director, said, that doesn't sit well with me. You will be now the National Performance Centre, or the Performance Centre Gold Coast Triathlon Australia. And I think that typifies who we are and who we're about. And we're learning from each other, and obviously the para-triathlon are learning how to be elite triathletes. And the able-bodied guys are learning some life lessons, which is pretty powerful.
Yeah, that's really fantastic to hear. And in terms of you as a coach, have you learned things from taking on this new challenge of coaching the para-athletes, like, for example, teaching technical cues to perhaps visibility impaired athletes and so on, or any just nugget really that you've picked up on how to coach better that you can now also apply with the able-bodied athletes?
Every day, every session, there's something that we discuss as a team. I try not to over dictate to the para program what I think they should do just because I'm a high performance able-bodied coach. It's more we collaborate on certain aspects of. I was privileged to help Katie Kelly build her new road bike and have huge ownership on how to come up with a bike that I felt would help her through Tokyo. So thinking outside the square with geometry, the fact that there was two people on the bike, not one, researching different tires to which, interestingly enough, the tires that I've put on her race wheels are now the tires I'm asking a lot of my able-bodied guys to get, because the fact that these tires stick well to the road, because there's two people on the bike instead of one, I've sort of gone, well, geez, that's going to work well on everyone's bike. So that's a simple example, but understanding on Lauren's hand cycle aerodynamics differences, and when I think of her bike, I think of a Formula One car as opposed to a standard UCI legal road bike. And where are the gains we can make in this machine that we throw to the ITU and go, hey, we want to do this. What's the chances of doing this? And they go away and try and give us a solution to our inquisitiveness. So yeah, it's really, really cool to because the tech side of it with para is way, way more than in able-bodied. When you talk about amputees and their running leg and stuff like that, which I've worked with and stuff like that, there's way more that you have to think outside the square with that, as opposed to able-bodied, most definitely.
Got it. Going back a bit to the coaching questions in terms of the planning and periodization, one thing that I wanted to ask as well is you've had the chance now to be with this squad all the way through from one Olympic and now building up to the next. So how do you plan the long-term training and periodization during that quadrennial, the Olympic quadrennial? What goes into that, and how do you think about that planning?
I'm not sure there's a lot of planning that goes into it. I fly by the seat of my pants a little bit sometimes, which isn't real scientific. I have some smart people around me that try and pull my head in a little bit and try and get me to be a little bit more thoughtful with things. But in Australia, we tend to work on 2 years, not 4 years. Whilst the Olympics is every 4 years, we also have a major competition, which is the Commonwealth Games, which is every 2 years. So for me, who can be a little A-type now and then and find it hard to settle down and get into a routine, every 2 years is something I can keep focused on. So I tend to work on a 2-year cycle, not a 4-year cycle. So for me, it's about trying to be the absolute best we can be in line up with the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games. And that tends to take a little bit of pressure off the fact that, let it be known, the Olympics, there's nothing bigger, nothing more serious for us than the Olympics. But the Commonwealth Games allows us to actually come up with strategies that can help us towards the Olympics. So what we worked on for 2018 has allowed me to continue on in the lead up to Tokyo. And the last 4 years, I've worked more with altitude as opposed to just heat and humidity. I've got a pretty good grasp on that. I've got some good people around me that help me with heat and humidity, and I'm a massive believer that it is of equal value to altitude, has equal responses. So that's, again, our natural environment, heat and humidity. But altitude is something I've played with since before the Commonwealth Games in 2018, and that's something obviously I want to continue on. So I sort of plan more around my altitude blocks than most other things.
And how often would you go to altitude?
We will go to altitude probably once a year, but we will do altitude blocks upwards of 3 times a year. So we might use altitude tents and do altitude-specific training sessions in a controlled environment, which we have the luxury of being able to utilize. So very fortunate that we can access that in Australia. Unfortunately for us, we were about to head off to our first altitude block later this month, but unfortunately with the Australian fires that I'm sure everyone's aware of, that has stopped us from doing that because the area we were going, which is the ski fields in New South Wales, has stopped us from being able to do that. So, but we will adapt to that and consider using altitude tents and specific altitude sessions in that period as well. Probably 2 targeted sessions, 2 targeted periods a year, most definitely.
Yeah. And within a 2-year cycle with the Commonwealth Games and the Olympics, then in that 2-year cycle, is there any market difference in what the year and the training looks like from one year to the next? Or are they more or less the same with some perhaps like a little bit of more specificity, or like peaking and tapering, of course, for the real major competition, but not that much difference in the more preparatory based training phase? Or is it actually a big difference, for example, holding back a bit on the training in the first year and then like building up through the major competition year? Or what's your take, or how do you work with that?
Well, I think with any major competition, it is dependent on the athletes as far as how do they come off that critical period. So in any high performance program, you may be fortunate enough to have athletes that have gained selection and have been fortunate enough to go off to these competitions. You may have athletes that missed out on selection, so you have to manage that state of emotion. So I always tend to take time to reflect post any big competition, and have after the Commonwealth Games, I made sure I had 2 weeks off pretty much straight away to gather my thoughts and recollect myself on where my program was and how we were going to rebuild. And it's, again, comes down to the individual athlete and making sure that they're comfortable knowing that, this year, or last year, for example, we had the test event that led 2 weeks later into our world title. Collectively, our program had a really good world title, but for the athletes that went to the test event, them carrying on that intensity and that quality of mindset into a major competition was near impossible. It was impossible of me to ask them to keep the hammer down leading into a world title. It was ludicrous of me to think that they could maintain that because of that state of emotion. So I guess a long-winded answer, but it comes down to the individual. And there is obviously, our nation will always set out, as far as the selection policy go, these are the targeted events. This is how you gain automatic selection. If you don't gain automatic selection, then this is the period in which you can be able to nominate or be nominated to come up for selection. So it's like a good game of chess. I think you've got to put all your pieces in front of you. You've always got to think probably two moves ahead and strategize around the individual of what's the best for that individual. Where should they go? What is the best quality of field they'll be chasing? Who are they coming up against? We have a bad habit in Australia of trying to compete against ourselves and chasing the green and gold uniform rather than tracing the race. And I've tried to make sure that in my planning we're chasing the targeted selection rather than just be the best Australian, because the best Australian at world titles for our females was something in the 20th and then 25th or 26th. Not necessarily world-class performances, but they were the first and best, second best Australian. So we've got to change that mindset to be up for key periods of time.
Yeah. We're approaching the end here. I have one final question before the rapid fire questions, and that is, it's a 2-part question. So the first part of it is, if you could give one key piece of advice for athletes listening, and specifically developing athletes that want to make it to a high performance level, even to the Olympic level, what would that be?
It would be consistency in the time you have available. So if you have 10 hours a week, make it the best 10 hours a week you can possibly have with your sport. Make sure that it is achievable week in, week out. The frequency in which you do that training in that 10 hours needs to be week in, week out. It can't go from 8 hours to 12 hours to 4 hours to 2 hours. If you commit to it, the best athletes I've had have always had consistency in the hours they've had to be able to achieve their training. They've always gotten results. So whether you work 40 hours a week with a family or more, if you can get a coach that understands what you do in life and set a plan based around the time you have available, and make sure you give absolutely everything to that time you have available.
I think you already answered the second part of my question, which was the same question, but for the age groupers. But I think you summed it up for everybody.
Well, I think it doesn't matter whether you're Olympic level athlete or age grouper or beginner, whatever it is. If you've got 5 hours, make it the best 5 hours. If you've got 30, make sure that whole 30 is 30 hours and not 28 hours.
Yeah, it makes total sense. I agree. So let's wrap up with the rapid fire questions, and these are short, 15 seconds or less. So it's a challenge, but we're starting with, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to triathlon?
Okay, well, that book is Applied Sports Psychology. It's a textbook that I have with me. It's almost my Bible.
And what's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
My own physical health.
And who's somebody in triathlon or endurance sports that you look up to and admire?
I will say Darren Smith and Michael Bowl, who's one of Australia's best swimming coaches.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan. I've really, really appreciated this, learned a lot. And it's great to hear these insights from people at the very top of the sport. So thanks again. It's a real pleasure to have you and hear all you have to teach.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
All right. I really hope that you enjoyed that interview. You can find the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com, and I will link to some related episodes with other high-performance coaches at the draft legal triathlon scene, and those are Adil Tveiten and Joel Filial with his squad of athletes from a wide range of countries. In next episode, or next Monday, I interview Andy Blow from our sponsor Precision Hydration on the latest developments in hydration. So that will be really interesting. Stay tuned for that. And if you want to, check out the products and services we offer on scientifictriathlon.com, ranging from ready-made training plans all the way up to individual coaching. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Get a free hydration plan, or check out their blog post that I'll link to on how to perform your sweat rate testing. And take 15% off your entire order with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And big thanks to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swim skins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear, and get 20% off your order with the promo code TTS20. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.